In Baltimore's quiet dawn, Fiona, a woman battling a hidden, relentless foe, opened her diner. Her $1 sunrise special offered sustenance and grace to weary souls. But beneath her stoic facade, a silent, agonizing war raged. Could a single dollar and a community's quiet hope truly defy the inevitable? The hour of 4:30 a.m. in Ironwood Alley, Baltimore, had its own particular silence. It was a heavy, damp quiet, steeped in the salt-laced air drifting from the harbor and the ghosts of yesterday's exhaust fumes. Inside the small, glowing box of Fiona's fill-up, another kind of silence reigned, one of focused, rhythmic effort. Fiona, 59 and moving with a deliberateness that belied the fire in her gut, was at her post. Each bend at the waist was a negotiation, with a hot, sharp blade twisting just beneath her ribs. The doctors called it late-stage gastric cancer. Fiona called it the unwelcome tenant, the one who refused to pay rent but demanded all her energy. She pressed a hand to her stomach for a brief, steadying moment, her breath catching in a silent wince before turning back to the griddle. Her domain was small, a six-burner stove, a well-seasoned flat top, and a counter that had seen 2 decades of Baltimore's weary elbows. On the griddle, her daily offering began to sizzle. The Sunrise Special, priced at $1. It had been $1 when her husband, Charles, was alive to work the register, and it was $1 now. 2 eggs, sunny-side up, their yolks a defiant splash of gold. 3 strips of bacon, crisp to the very edge of shattering. A single, thick slice of white bread, toasted and slathered with real butter. The aroma, salt, fat, and melting butter, was a familiar prayer, a hymn against the encroaching silence within her. This diner wasn't a business anymore, not really. It was a vow, a promise she'd made to herself, to Charles's memory, to the very bricks of this tired building that had given them a life. It was her reason to defy the tenant in her stomach, to swing her legs out of bed when every fiber of her being screamed for stillness. She worked with a practiced grace, her spatula an extension of her hand, turning the bacon with a flick of her wrist, nudging the eggs into perfect circles. The pain was a constant, low hum, but the routine was a fortress against it. As the first hint of gray light began to dilute the darkness outside, Fiona flipped the sign on the door from closed to open. The sun wasn't up yet, but in the quiet heart of Ironwood Alley, Fiona was already serving its sunrise. Among the handful of early risers who treated Fiona's fill-up as a sanctuary was Brett. At 26, he possessed the lean, hungry look of an artist who traded worldly comforts for the currency of words. He wasn't homeless, but his existence was a precarious patchwork of odd jobs, unloading icy crates of fish at the market, a graveyard shift stocking shelves at a 24-hour convenience store that barely covered the rent on his cramped, anonymous room 4 blocks away. His world outside these 4 walls was loud, transient, and indifferent. Fiona's, in contrast, was the only place that felt like home. Every morning, around 6 a.m., he would slide into the corner booth, the one with the cracked red vinyl that felt molded to his shape. He'd place a single, crinkled dollar bill on the counter, and the silent ritual would commence. Fiona would nod, and a few minutes later, the Sunrise Special would appear before him. For Brett, that plate was more than sustenance. It was the anchor of his day, a small, perfect island of order in a sea of chaos. He ate slowly, deliberately, making the meal last. Then he would pull out a worn, dog-eared notebook and a cheap ballpoint pen. And for the next 3 or 4 hours, the diner became his office, his studio, his entire world. He wrote, but mostly he watched. He had become a quiet chronicler of Fiona, a student of her subtle, painful grace. He saw what the other patrons, lost in their own fatigue, did not. The truckers and construction workers saw a plate of hot food for a fair price. They saw a cook. Brett saw a warrior. He noticed the increasing pallor of her skin, a translucent gray that seemed to absorb the weak morning light. He saw the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as she refilled the salt shakers, and the way she would sometimes pause in the narrow space by the refrigerator, leaning her shoulder against the cool metal and closing her eyes for a second that stretched into an eternity. In those moments, the stoic mask of the proprietor would slip, revealing a profound, bone-deep weariness. His notebook began to fill with observations about her, fragments of a portrait he felt compelled to capture. She places the bacon on the griddle like she's arranging jewels on velvet. The way she hands you the plate, it's not a transaction. It's a gift. There's a war going on inside her, but her hands are still kind. He wasn't mining for material or looking for a story to sell. He was bearing witness. In a life where he felt powerless, documenting her strength felt like a meaningful act. He recognized the fight because he was in one of his own, a battle against obscurity, against the gnawing fear that his words would forever remain confined to the pages of his cheap notebook. In Fiona's quiet, relentless dignity, he found a strange and powerful kinship. She was fighting for her life by serving others, and he, the silent observer in the corner, felt an urgent, growing need to ensure her story didn't just fade away with the morning mist. The slow decline steepened into a fall. The unwelcome tenant in Fiona's stomach grew bolder, its demands more insistent, its presence a constant, grinding agony. The mornings became a blur of pain management, of forcing down a piece of dry toast just to have something to absorb the nausea that churned like a cement mixer. One Tuesday, the griddle seemed to tilt and sway before her eyes. A burly truck driver named Sal, a regular for 15 years whose life story she knew in chapters of bacon and eggs, was waiting for his breakfast. As Fiona turned from the stove, a wave of vertigo washed over her, violent and absolute. The world went black for a second, the familiar sounds of the diner dissolving into a roaring static. The heavy ceramic plate slipped from her grasp. It shattered on the linoleum floor with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot, a sharp, definitive crack that sliced through the morning quiet. Eggs splattered, their bright yolks bleeding across the worn tiles. Bacon skittered under the counter. A profound silence descended. Sal froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The two other customers in the diner stared, unsure how to react. Fiona didn't apologize. She didn't even look at them. She simply stared at the mess, a yellow and white mosaic of her failure. With a low groan that seemed to be pulled from the depths of her soul, she bent down, her body protesting with every inch of the movement. She began to pick up the larger shards of ceramic with a hand that shook so violently she could barely hold them. In her eyes, for the first time, Brett saw not just weariness but the stark, hollow look of utter defeat. It was a vulnerability she had never allowed to surface, and it was devastating to witness. The day's humiliation was compounded by a letter that arrived in the afternoon mail. It was from her primary food supplier, a crisp, impersonal invoice with a message typed in bold red letters at the bottom. She was $1,247.82 in arrears. The letter was a final notice, stripped of all pleasantries. If the balance wasn't settled within 3 business days, all future deliveries would be suspended. That was it. The last straw. There was no hidden reserve, no emergency fund tucked away for a rainy day. It had been raining for years. Every dollar she made, and most of the generous dollars her customers left as tips, went straight to the pharmacy for medications that barely touched the pain. Closing the diner had always been an abstract fear, a distant storm cloud on the horizon. Now, it was a tidal wave, looming and black, about to crash over her. That evening, long after the last customer had gone, Fiona sat alone in the corner booth, Brett's booth. The smell of stale coffee and old grease hung in the air like a shroud. She stared at the red-ink number on the page, and for the first time since Charles had died, she felt the fight drain out of her completely. She laid her head down on the cool formica tabletop and let out a single, ragged sob. The tenant had won. That night sleep offered Brett no escape. He tossed and turned in his narrow bed, the image of Fiona on her hands and knees, surrounded by the wreckage of a single breakfast, burned into his mind. Her look of raw, unguarded despair had shaken him to his core. He had spent months as a passive observer, a silent admirer of her strength. Now he felt like a coward. Sympathy was a useless currency. Silence was a betrayal. He threw back the thin blanket and sat at his small, wobbly desk. The city hummed outside his window, indifferent. He opened his notebook, the pages filled with his scribbled notes about her, and a new, fierce urgency took hold of him. He wasn't just a writer searching for a subject anymore. He was a witness with a testimony to give. Flipping to a clean page, he began to write. The words didn't trickle out, they poured. He titled it simply, "Sunrise in Ironwood Alley Costs $1." He wrote about the alchemy of the griddle, the quiet dignity of a $1 meal served with the care of a feast. He described the worn counter as a lifeline for the city's forgotten, the early morning workers and the down-on-their-luck who found more than just cheap food at Fiona's fill-up. They found a moment of grace. He didn't mention the word cancer. He didn't have to. Instead, he painted a portrait of her resilience, describing the tremor in her hands not as a sign of weakness, but as evidence of the immense weight she carried. He wrote of her tired eyes, but framed them as windows to a spirit that refused to be extinguished. It was a love letter to a stranger who had become his hero. He wrote through the night, fueled by black coffee and a righteous anger at the injustice of it all. By dawn, it was finished. He read it over, his heart pounding. It was the most honest thing he had ever written. He knew what he had to do. Later that morning, summoning a courage he didn't know he possessed, he walked into the modest downtown office of the Ironwood Chronicle, the local weekly paper. He handed the folded pages to the tired-looking receptionist, his hands trembling just as he'd seen Fiona's do. He didn't expect anything, but he had to try. He had to give her story a voice beyond the four walls of the diner. On Friday, it appeared. Tucked away on page 3 of the Ironwood Chronicle, between an ad for a local plumber and a notice about a city council meeting, was his article, "Sunrise in Ironwood Alley Costs $1." Brett bought 10 copies, his hands shaking as he saw his own words in print, feeling a terrifying mix of pride and fear. He spent the day in a state of anxious dread, rereading the piece, wondering if he'd overstepped, if he'd stripped away the dignity of the very person he sought to honor. What if she saw it as pity? What if she hated him for exposing her struggle to the world? Saturday morning arrived, cold and clear. At 5:30 a.m., Fiona, moving slower than ever after a night of relentless pain, unlocked the door to her diner. She braced herself for another day of solitary struggle, the supplier's red-inked letter await in her pocket. But when she looked up, she stopped dead in her tracks, her hand still on the key. A line. There was a line of people standing on the sidewalk outside her door. Not the usual 2 or 3 regulars waiting for their first coffee, but a queue of at least 30 people. A silent, respectful procession that stretched from her entrance and snaked around the corner of the block. They were all ages, all walks of life, and in their hands many of them were holding a copy of the Chronicle. Fiona stared, bewildered, a knot of confusion and fear tightening in her chest. An elderly woman at the front of the line, someone she'd never seen before, held up the paper and gave her a watery, compassionate smile. "We're here for the sunrise, dear," she said softly, her voice carrying in the crisp air. "We read about it." The first few customers came in, their eyes filled with a gentle reverence. They ordered the sunrise special, and Fiona moved on autopilot, her mind reeling. But when she turned from the register, she saw they were leaving not just $1 or 2, but 20s, 50s, even $100 bills tucked under their plates. A young woman with pink hair, a student by the looks of her, pressed a folded note into Fiona's hand as she left. Inside was $50 and the words, "Thank you for not giving up. You make me want to not give up either." Another man, a construction worker with dust on his boots and calloused hands, just looked her in the eye and said, "My mom fought that fight too. You're not alone." His simple words struck her with the force of a physical blow. The stream of people was endless. They weren't just customers, they were pilgrims. They came to pay homage. Around 9 a.m., Art, The plumber whose ad had run next to Brett's article came in, his face set with determination. He bypassed the line, walked straight to the counter, and thrust a thick, lumpy envelope into Fiona's apron pocket. "From the guys at the Plumbers and Steamfitters Local 48, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "This community takes care of its own. You've been taking care of us for 20 years. It's our damn turn." Fiona was overwhelmed, her mind unable to process the sheer volume of kindness. She stumbled back against the counter, looking at the sea of compassionate faces filling every seat, every inch of standing room in her tiny diner. She saw the crumpled newspapers, the bills left on the counter, the quiet, respectful nods. And then she finally understood. This wasn't charity. This wasn't pity. This was love. This was a city returning the grace she had given out, one plate at a time, for 2 decades. The dam of her lifelong, fiercely protected stoicism finally broke. Leaning against the doorframe that had supported her for so long, the strong, unshakable Fiona wept, not from pain or despair, but from a profound, staggering wave of gratitude that washed through her, cleansing and absolute. At the very back of the line, disguised by a baseball cap, Brett watched, tears streaming down his own face, his heart feeling like it might burst from his chest. He had wanted to give her a voice, and an entire city had answered her call. The wave of support that crested on Saturday didn't recede. It became a tide. The story of the $1 sunrise, of the woman who fought her own battle by feeding others, became the talk of the town. The initial flood of cash easily covered the supplier's bill, and then some. But the people of Ironwood Alley knew that was just a bandage on a much deeper wound. They wanted to offer not just a rescue, but a future. Led by Art the plumber, a man whose gruff exterior concealed a fiercely loyal heart, a plan began to form. He called a meeting at the Union Hall the following week. It was packed. Brett was there, sitting quietly in the back, no longer just an observer but an accidental catalyst. Art stood before the crowd, shop owners, teachers, mechanics, retirees, and laid it out simply. "Fiona's done enough," he declared. "It's time for her to rest. But this place," he gestured in the direction of the diner, "this place needs to stay." From that meeting, the Fiona's Fill-Up Foundation was born. It was a beautiful, chaotic, grassroots effort. A retired accountant, Mrs. Gable, volunteered to manage the finances, creating a transparent system for donations and expenses. A young, ambitious chef from a recently closed bistro offered to take over the kitchen, promising to learn Fiona's recipes down to the last grain of salt. Dozens of others signed up for a volunteer roster to work the counter, wash dishes, and clean up, ensuring the diner could operate without putting a single burden on its namesake. A few days later, Art, Mrs. Gable, and the young chef approached Fiona. They found her not behind the counter but sitting in Brett's booth, looking stronger than she had in months. They laid out their proposal. The community would formally take over the diner's operations. The Sunrise Special would remain $1 forever. All profits, after covering costs and a fair wage for the new chef, would go directly into a fund for her medical treatments and living expenses. They weren't asking to buy her out. They were asking for her permission to carry her legacy forward. "Your only job now, Fiona," Art said, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it, "is to be our supervisor, our quality control, our guiding star. Your only job is to get well."